Can you believe it's been 10 years since the Hannibal TV show first premiered on April 4th, 2013, where the show graced our screens lasting for only 3 years, where the series was brutally cancelled, in my opinion, way ahead of its time by NBC Studios. And you may be thinking, well, why the cancellation? Supposedly, low ratings are to blame, but I feel it's a combination of this and that the show was basically too expensive to make, and perhaps in that respect, was way ahead of its time with the originality that it managed to source, and that was something that, regardless of what happened to the series, I feel showrunner Brian Fuller really did deliver on a unique retelling of the original novels by Thomas Harris. And although technically only two of those original novels were actually retold in the legacy of the Hannibal series, the originality and the stylistic choices used throughout made for some stunning television. And hopefully, later down the line, regardless of how long it takes, hopefully we will see a further continuation with this incarnation of the Hannibal Lecter franchise.
Going my way?
When season 4 looked to be possible, as I'll vaguely term it, Brian Fuller did reach out to MGM, hoping to secure the rights for the Silence of the Lambs story, since obviously they made the film adaptation back in 1991 starring Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins, and with that in mind, they were holding on to the rights for that story very tightly. And Fuller supposedly was very close to actually getting the rights to actually tell this story in his own TV show, the only issue being the cancellation. And so, if the show hadn't been cancelled, I'd like to think that, fingers crossed, they could have told the story and actually brought everything together when it came down to retelling the original three Hannibal Lecter stories from Harris. But regardless, things have obviously moved on since then, and Fuller supposedly has something unique up his sleeve should the series ever get a green light going forward with another studio. So regardless, there is hope for a new direction going forward even after the cancellation, but whether or not that will happen anytime soon, we shall see. Looking back on the show, overall, beginning with season 1, this is extremely well crafted where it takes all the necessary inspirations from Red Dragon, mainly certain characters, themes, and names, and expands upon this greatly, and I love how contemporary the show feels, where we see Hannibal Lecter in his prime as a psychiatrist, and several characters throughout are really given a lot more depth and detail that you don't really see throughout the pages of a novel because they weren't really main characters as such. And the fact that the writers behind this series were able to give so much life to names we had only referenced when it came to the original source material, overall, I find that to be an exhilarating way to really enhance a franchise such as this. Looking at the main plot of the show, it focuses on building Hannibal into a villainous protagonist, and as the audience, we somewhat share Will Graham's point of view, where he's working with the FBI, his role being a criminal profiler, only he has a very wild imagination which takes a toll on his mental health. And so, in doing his job, he's referred to Lecter for help to process the various traumatic experiences that he goes through. And this works phenomenally throughout the first season to establish each prominent character, where each episode is given kind of a murder of the week ordeal. And it's really fun to see how, as a side plot, the FBI are looking to track down a legendary serial killer, the Chesapeake Ripper. Little do they realize the Ripper is closer than they think. And we see the very unique chemistry between Will Graham and Hannibal evolve as the episodes continue, and I really appreciate how the actors Hugh Dancy and Mads Mikkelsen really make these characters their own and don't really borrow too much from previous iterations of the characters as seen on screen.
This is a courtesy call. Listen very carefully. They know.
Onward from the first episode, the show often refers back to a serial killer shown very prominently in the first episode, nicknamed the Minnesota Shrike, that being Garrett Jacob Hobbs. Overall, a really interesting character who used his teenage daughter to lure college girls to their deaths, and when caught, Hannibal oddly warns him about the arrest where Will Graham is forced to murder Hobbs during a very difficult hostage situation, thus saving the daughter, Abigail. And as the show continues, we see Will's mental health deteriorate, suffering from various hallucinations, which are some of the most beautifully constructed scenes in the entire show, and elements of losing time, losing his grip on reality. And episode 7 is one of my absolute favourites, which is an excellent deconstruction of how Will feels about murdering Hobbs, especially in relation to Abigail and the guilt he must be feeling for orphaning her. And throughout this, we also learn more about Hannibal and what he's capable of, with various scenes of confrontation showing his true nature. Episode 8 was my personal favourite from this run in particular, where Lecter investigates a musician that's brought to his attention, which leads to one of my personal favourite fight sequences in Season 1. And with the ending of this season leaving us with a cliffhanger, Hannibal successfully frames Will Graham, who gets too close for comfort in learning the truth that Lecter is the Chesapeake Ripper, and so with him deceiving the FBI and Will ends up imprisoned at the Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, leading into Season 2, which was my personal favourite season of the show. Season 2 oddly begins with the ending, with one of the most beautifully choreographed and action-packed fight scenes between the cunning Dr. Lecter and overall a very intimidating Jack Crawford portrayed by Lawrence Fishburne. And his range of acting throughout the show is exceptional, showing off his various talents and how he is so well utilized for this role. And there is no context given to this fight other than it is very gory, very brutal, where the story resumes after this, seeing Will Graham wanting to prove his innocence, and this works to Hannibal's advantage, where he is slowly shaping Will into a killer, where he wants to share with a man that he views as an equal this depraved world of cannibalistic murder, and whenever feasible, one should always eat the rude, and he practices this and preaches it to Will, who knows there is something far more going on with Dr. Lecter, and Lecter views Will as something very unique, and he plans to shape that into something far greater for the most immoral reasons imaginable.
I want you to kill Hannibal Lecter.
He manipulates certain people to his favor, such as Dr. Gideon, played by Eddie Izzard, one of my favorite side characters, and how Will is able to convince an orderly at the hospital, someone that actually admires him, to murder Hannibal Lecter. And episode 5 is my personal favorite, a very intense episode where Matthew Brown, the orderly, gets very close to killing the Chesapeake Ripper himself, even forcing a confession out of Dr. Lecter. And overall, the writing and the dialogue, it's absolutely incredible, and the way the horrific symbolism shown visually, and especially featured throughout the episodes going forward, sees Lecter hanging from a noose in balance on a bucket, almost literally kicking the bucket to his demise. And the intensity continues as the show progresses, where Hannibal is able to thankfully keep his identity as the Chesapeake Ripper a secret and concealed until the very last episode, Mizumono. And that was for sure one of the most incredible and overall well-written parts of the entire show. The final result of this episode is honestly one of the goriest endings from really any series I have ever seen, and it genuinely seems impossible for the characters to have even survived Hannibal's wrath, but obviously they did, with many scars, might I add, as we go into Season 3. Season 3 is overall a fascinating experience where we obviously continue from the cliffhanger in Season 2, as we see most of the main characters more or less surgically put back together, and we see what finally happened to Lecter, where he escaped in the last season and actually made his way over to Italy. And this is where we finally delve into some of the original storytelling from both the Hannibal novel, which is overall an incredible book for sure, one that I would recommend, and my personal favourite from the original Hannibal Lecter trilogy, that being Red Dragon. And with the first half of this season, it does primarily focus on retelling Hannibal, who, having escaped to Italy, where Will Graham and Jack Crawford are close to tracking them down, little do they realize Mason Verger, who was set up as a villain in the previous season, is also out to capture Hannibal Lecter. And with this revenge plot, it's expertly told, overall very well written, where Hannibal's motivations do change throughout, especially when Will Graham is in danger. In one of the most grotesque scenes from the previous season, Mason seeks revenge for his disfigurement sustained, where he manages to cut off most of his lower face. And so he intends on wearing Will Graham's face to actually eat Hannibal Lecter. Overall, a pretty crazy plot thread with a very surprising and satisfying conclusion, which leads to Hannibal finally surrendering himself to the FBI. And so, wrapping up the season, we are given a proper retelling of Red Dragon, and although some changes do occur with certain characters taking the place of others, such as Dr. Chilton taking place of Freddie Lowndes, the story is still coherent and still remains my personal favourite. Richard Armitage takes on the villainous role of Francis Dolarhyde, aka the Tooth Fairy serial killer, or as he prefers to be known as, the Great Red Dragon. And various moments of unspoken acting in particular are just so unsettling, where Armitage really does give this performance his all. And I absolutely love the silent moments where he is obsessing over the original painting by William Blake. Even the moment where he actually consumes the painting is both ridiculous but also very harrowing for just how this painting possesses his existence. And with that in mind, there's a bit of a time jump where we see Jack Crawford trying to recruit Will Graham once again to investigate this Tooth Fairy serial killer. And as the events of the show continue, I love how when Hannibal Lecter finally escapes custody, having somewhat teased the Tooth Fairy serial killer, they come together, him and Will, and manage to defeat the Red Dragon themselves. And this ending sequence is just poetic justice, where Will finally does see the dark side in Hannibal, and together they take down Dolarhyde with a very open-ended twist to their story. Dolarhyde is brutally murdered and left for dead with so many very unsettling images, and where Hannibal and Will finally come together on a mutual basis, Will allows them both to be pushed over a cliff with some very evocative background music to this scene as well, where the camera does a vertical pan down to the cliff bottom, only for there to be no sign of any bodies. Will we ever get a proper answer as to whether or not Hannibal Lecter and Will Graham survived? I have no idea, but fingers crossed there will perhaps be some form of continuation of this show later down the line. At the very least, I would love to have a bow-out performance done of a perhaps even mini-series for television, or even a theatrical movie utilizing these actors and their interpretations of these iconic characters to perhaps make Silence of the Lambs a reality. I would love to see that happen. I think every single member of the cast and those behind the scenes are extremely talented to make something like that happen, and fingers crossed with this being the 10-year anniversary and there being still a huge amount of interest in this show going forward, that perhaps one day we will eventually see a form of a continuation for Hannibal as a show. And so on that note, that's going to do it for this video looking over and looking back on the entirety of the Hannibal television series. I hope you did enjoy. If you did, be sure to leave me a like down below. Let me know in the comments, are you a fan of the Hannibal television show? What is your favourite moment from the series? I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions. And of course, for more content, be sure to subscribe.
Are you threatening me?